All right, good to see you. We're going to talk today about Thomas Hardy's poem, which is called The Man He Killed. And we're going to talk about it today because recently you read a chapter in Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried called The Man I Killed. And I think the two titles are so similar, they bear examination. Okay? It's important to know that Thomas Hardy is a seminal war poet. And so this poem is likely known by a lot of people in the literary world, and Tim O'Brien is in the literary world, so we can make some assumptions that he's probably familiar with this poem. But I think there's also some similarities between the content of this poem and his story, The Man I Killed. So I'm going to read it to you, and I'm going to stop here and there and say a few things, and then next time I see you, hopefully we'll chat about it. So here's how it starts. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin. Now, one of the things you need to know is that a nipperkin is a beer, okay? And he's basically saying, if we had met at an inn together, an inn is basically a bar, then we might have had some beers together. But we didn't meet at a bar, right? We met in a war. So, but, ranged as infantry, and staring face to face, I shot at him and he at me and killed him in his place, okay? Infantry is soldiers, so they met on the battlefield, and so they didn't have beers together. They shot at each other. I shot him dead because he was my foe. Just so. My foe. Of course he was. That's clear enough. Although he thought he'd list perhaps, offhand like just as I. Was out of work, had sold his traps. No other reason why. Yes. Quaint and curious war is. You'd shoot a fellow down. You'd treat, if met where any bar is, or help to half a crown. So at the end of the poem, this reference to half a crown, this is money. He's basically saying, if I met him at a bar, I would treat him. Or if he needed some money, I would offer it to him. But we met in a war, and war is so curious that we ended up shooting at each other, and I killed him. But if you look at this word, quaint, I would make the case that war is not so quaint. Quaint is a word that's usually reserved for like snug, cozy, nice things, not war. And I would say that's a place where if we wondered if Thomas Hardy had been being ironic, it's really hitting home there. And if you look at these two stanzas, the third and fourth stanza, and if you pay attention to all of these M dashes are also called long dashes. They're used by writers to indicate interruption of thought. So in these two stanzas, the speaker's having lots of interruptions of thought before he gets to the idea that war is quaint and curious. Okay? So that's the gist of the poem. Another thing I'd like you to look at is really tiny. It has to do with the punctuation. You'll notice the poem opens with this open quotation mark, right? And there's an open quotation mark here, and there's an open quotation mark here, and there's another one here, and there's another one here. But if you look at the ends of the stanzas, there are no end quotation marks until you get to this one. Now, it's standard when you have two people having a dialogue to have a new stanza every time somebody new speaks, or a new paragraph every time somebody new speaks in prose. But if somebody says a whole lot, if they say paragraphs or stanzas worth of material before they finish speaking, you withhold the second quotation mark. So you have an open quotation mark here, and you withhold the closed quotation mark here. So all of this is one big piece of dialogue, which I would say turns the poem just a little bit, because it means that Thomas Hardy, or Thomas Hardy's speaker, is really a listener to a tale told by a soldier. That speaker, or that Thomas Hardy, is not somebody who's served in the military himself who is attesting to this truth. It's something that he heard somebody say. So it just sort of turns the narrative stance of the poem a little bit, and it sort of tweaks the relationship between the speaker and the listener, and I think Tim O'Brien does a lot of that. But there's other similarities too that are worth talking about, and maybe we will when I see you next.